My name is Glockner, and this is April the 27th, 1989, and it's my intent to try to put together on a videotape many memories and things remembered that were said about our ancestors who came over from the old country, and their children and their children's children. So I have the camera now on the picture of the Glockner family who were born in this country by the father, Bernard Glockner, and his wife, Magdalena Beck Glockner. From left to right is Frank Glockner, Adolph Glockner, Louise Glockner, who became Sister Aquin in the Order of St. Francis in Rochester, Minnesota, Bill Glockner, Anna Glockner Meyer, Adolph Glockner, and Charles Glockner. This picture was taken in 1891 at the time of their mother's death, and this was the last time these children were ever together again. My name is Zeb Glockner. His brother Leo left Germany in 1847. They were born and reared in Bingen-Baden, Germany, which is about 15 to 20 miles south of Freiburg, near the Black Forest area of Germany. They came to this country with a couple and their daughter, who were also from Bingen-Baden, by the name of Stefan Beck, and his wife Anna Kind, K-I-N-D, Beck, and a daughter Anna. They eventually, after landing in this country, made their way to Cincinnati, Ohio. We do not know why they chose Cincinnati, but knowing that many of the people that were immigrants sought locations where friends who had come to this country prior to them served as a staging point for them to get their feet on the ground and learn the English language and find their vocation in life. We do not know why, but Bernard Glockner and Leo Glockner came up the river from Cincinnati and settled in Portsmouth, Ohio. we know that they both were salesmen or clerks of one type or another, and I will read you information from the 1960 census. Now you have to remember that's 12 years after they arrived here. Bernard Glockner in 1960 was 35 years of age. He was a salesman. He was born in Bingen-Baden, Germany. He had a net worth of real estate of $1,500 and personal property of $800. His wife was Magdalena, age 28. She also was born in Bingen-Baden, Germany. At this time they had 3 children: Francis, age 5, Anna, age 3, and Louise, age 2. His brother Leo Glockner in 1960 was 40 years of age, 5 years older than Bernard. His occupation was a grocer. He was born in Bingen-Baden, and they show that he was a brother to Bernard. And his net worth in real estate was $2,200, and his personal property $400. His wife was Elizabeth. She was 30 years of age, and she was born in Rheinbein, R-H-E-I-N, capital B-I-E-R-N, Germany. They had 4 children: Adam, age 11, Louis, age 9, Emma, age 3, and Leo, age 6 months. As I was told, my grandfather, Bernard, after he was settled in Portsmouth, went back to Cincinnati and asked Stephen and Anna Beck for their daughter Anna's hand in marriage. Anna said that she was already betrothed to a man by the name of Zimmerer, but her sister Magdalena was on her way over from Germany and was not promised to anyone. And so Bernard came on back to Portsmouth, and in a couple months he went back to Cincinnati and met Magdalena and asked for her hand in marriage, and of course they were married. And the 7 children that I showed you on the picture a few minutes ago were the offspring of that marriage. Now Bernard Glockner went to work for a fellow by the name, a German by the way, by the name of John Rottinghouse, who had a hardware store. And John Rottinghouse sold the hardware store to great-grandfather Bernard Glockner, and John Rottinghouse went on in to a larger hardware operation with some other investors. Bernard then operated his hardware store on Market Street, and he did quite well. He has, I have some write-ups out of the paper that was researched, and I'd like to read one of the articles that was taken from the paper as to what they thought of great-grandfather Bernard. This article was taken from the Portsmouth Times and was headed up, "Glockner Hardware Company observes its 50th anniversary." It was dated 1927, which would indicate that great-grandfather did not, well, I can't say with certainty. That you've got to remember, this article is written by Glockner Hardware Company. The original Glockner hardware was named B. Glockner Hardware. just the letter B. When great-grandfather Bernard died in 1876, they changed the name of the hardware to M. Glockner after Magdalena, who was left with these 7 children. And you have to remember that Magdalena lived until 1891. But I think that great-grandfather bought this hardware store back in around 1848, 1849. So this article's written in as if Glockner Hardware Company was founded in 1877. So we do know that it was in existence at grandfather's death in 1876. So next week, the Glockner Hardware Company will observe the 50th anniversary of the founding of the original store by Bernard Glockner, one of that splendid class of staid, industrious, frugal Germans that served to make up the greater part of business community in the early days. Mr. Bernard Glockner was born in Baden-Baden near Bingen, Dear Bingen on the Rhine, coming to Portsmouth the same year that so many of that class did in 1847. In the early 70s, he took over the hardware store at 206 Market Street that had been conducted by John Rottinghouse, and later, going with John L. Hibbs, Rottinghouse went with the Hibbs Hardware Company, who were in the same line of trade on Front Street. The original building that the hardware business was in is still in existence today. There is a shoe store in that place of business. We have pictures of it, and it looks like it will be preserved for many more years. Mr. Glockner died, Bernard Glockner died in 1876, and his burial took place from St. Mary's Church. It is recalled that the funeral cortege was the largest ever seen in the city, clearly demonstrating the high esteem in which the deceased was held. Father Noonan conducted the funeral, and he paid a glowing tribute to the sturdy character of the deceased Bernard Glockner, who was well and favorably known and universally respected. When half a century ago Bernard Glockner established a small store that has grown to such large proportions under capable management of members of the family, even the high-wheel bicycle had scarcely made its bow to the public. Horse-drawn streetcars were being discussed, cisterns were few, and residents brought river water by the barrel. John Cooley was kept busy making harness and selling horse collars. Sales in the store then were largely that of plows, churns, buck saws, post hole diggers, spades, grindstones, and such goods, including large iron and brass kettles. The letterware in general use in the making of a family supply of apple butter, 10 gallons or more. Also, soft soap for the kitchen use was made from the kettles. Market Street at that time was the center of business activity, and there was much river and canal trade. There was but one railroad, the M&C, with its platform at 6th Street. The hotels were all on Market Street or west of there, and the bank, 5 of them, were on Market Street, and Front Street from Court to Madison was one line of jobber houses. Markets were held twice a week in the mornings on Market Street. Truck farmers coming from Dogwood Ridge, Brewery Hollow Run, Munn's Run, and other distant points. The market house was a scene of political gatherings, as in the 60s it had been the recruiting headquarters. It was from Market Square that the gallant old 5th Street Ohio Volunteer Infantry departed for the front in the Civil War, leaving on February the 22nd, 1862, on the steamer Poland and the steamer Commander for Fort Donelson via Paducah. Major Charles F. Renninger was in command. He had been landlord of the Renninger House at the corner of 3rd and built at the ill-fated National Hotel on Sauda Street. The following were among the downtown merchants: A. and B. Brunner, A. Corral, Dan White, Dr. Kotzelben, H. P. Yeager, Pat Kenrick, John T. Miller, John Neal, Charles Schmidt, Ed Wright, John Fendies, Chance Wilson, A. D. Miller, Dr. McGuire, George Watkins, Phil Graham, Fred Rackenhouse, Fred Dorr, P. J. LeGrand, John Herder, Adam Giesler, Frank Weldy, Ed Rhine, Adam Weiss, and others. Jake Weatherwax had a blacksmith shop on the west side of the square near Plumbing Ship on 3rd, just east of Market Street. On the northwest corner of 3rd and Market Street, Nichols, Ross and Company conducted a furniture store, while Makeham's livery barn was adjoining. At 4th Street, James Charlesworth had a marble works, and adjoining him, the Venerable Pious David Ramsey operated a grocery. St. Mary's Church was without a cupola, bell or clock, all of which were added later, and to the west was the MC Yards, where Nat Barber and Henry Davison looked to the weighing of the tons of pig iron that came in from the Bloom and other furnaces. It was in the 70s that the Seeburgers had a fruit stand on the Brunner corner, and at times Henry Bertram and Cotton Bernstein, Spud McCann, and Warren Gaiman were known to help themselves to peanuts when the busy Abe was selling a Gazette. However, be it said to the credit of the now prosperous Ohio stoveman that meeting Mr. Seeburger at Atlantic City only a few years ago, he tendered the one-time sidewalk merchant $1 as part compensation for what stand, but not only was the money declined, but so glad was Mr. Seeburg to see the erstwhile bony fiddle youngster that the two dined a la carte at the Marlboro Blenheim at the former's expense. They discussed boyhood days, much to each other's enjoyment. Mr. Seeburg recalls that the time when Egg Gates beat him in Enquire delivery to the Andes, Vernier, Europa, and Taylor House and the Wharf, secured a pony and bought the papers from the 6th Street station in far less time than George, Meyer, or Julius could do. Henry says them were the days. Following Bernard Glockner's death, the hardware business was carried on by the widow, her son, Frank, Alex M., and Adolph being in charge, the two latter growing up with the business as both had been in the store for years. On the death of the father, Frank M. Glockner, the eldest son, elected to engage in other enterprises, and he did so later, going west, where he reared a large family and has been quite successful. Mrs. Glockner died in 1891, that's Magdalena, and it was then that Alex M. and his brother Adolph took over the store. And up to the time of Alex Glockner's untimely death, which was just 2 years ago, he died in 1925 at the age of 60. And up until that time, he was in active control and with marked success. He was foremost in seeing the city prosper and was proud of the fact that he was partly responsible for its expansion. Mr. Glockner aided materially in the building of the Washington Hotel and was a director in that company. He promoted and advocated the building of the new U.S. Grant Bridge over the Ohio River, now nearing completion, and it would have been a source of keen delight to him had he lived to drive and walk over it as he fully expected to do, and to have been present at the dedication so soon to take place. Mr. Glockner was a lover of nature's God's greatest outdoors and was known as a true sportsman. He annually visited Michigan and Canada on fishing trips with companions, and returning was plentifully supplied with large fish and game. He owned a camp adjacent to the Roosevelt Game Preserve and had expected to establish a silver fox farm there when unfortunately he was called by death. Mr. Glockner, who following a college course acquired a keen knowledge of business and how it should be conducted, enlarged the storeroom and added many new lines, including bicycles, sporting goods, fishing gear, and so on. The room added was of an L room cast out of the Brunner corner. The property long owned was occupied by Phil Zollner. This gave the enterprising new proprietor much necessary room to meet the growing demands of trade. But it was not many years before he was again crowded and was on the lookout for larger quarters. The business in which he was ably assisted by members of the family grew to such an extent that still more room was necessary, and in 1914 he moved the store to Gallia and Gay Street, taking over the entire Heinrich building. Bicycles and carriages having had their day, Mr. Glockner's keen vision saw the coming of the automobile, and he added a line of good merchandise to his already large stock and built up such a large business, buying the property adjoining his residence at 2nd and Chillicothe Streets and establishing a permanent sales room there. Later he built a modern structure to house this large sideline, the handling of the Chevrolet. Having an opportunity to acquire the partly burned out Turley building across the street from the automobile sales room, he did so, and remodeling it, moved the hardware business into it, and occupying the large corner room as well as the second and third floors of that corner block. Here other lines of goods, trunks, cases, paints, radios, washing machines, stoves, were added, including novelties of many kinds, camping goods, baseball, football, tennis, golfing outfits, and large stocks of kindred goods, along with glass cutting and installation, and a large inventory of firearms that could have been found in many larger city stores. The Glockner Hardware Company employs a complete staff of competent assistants and prides itself in giving the best of service. The Sun-Times joins with its many thousands of readers in wishing the company a long continued success. I know that was lengthy, but I don't know any other way, and that's about the only thing we have been able to find that gave us any background on the past history of the Glockners in business. I do know that Frank Glockner, who was referred to, and the oldest son of Bernard of Magdalena, had a stove store, and his wife, who was a Lang, L-A-N-G, from Lawrenceburg, Indiana, had a family of 5 children and was in her early 30s, and in wiping down and polishing a stove in the place of business, which was up on the 1200 block of Gallia Street, that the rag caught fire, her clothing caught fire, and she was burned to the extent that it cost her her life. And this left Frank with 5 young children. and I'll come back to that later and tell you how that family was raised. I'd like to take a moment to elaborate on great-grandfather Bernard Glockner. As we know, he married into the Beck family, and his sister-in-law, Anna Zimmerer, evidently they were all close and kept contact, and I have a letter that a Bob Zimmerer, Zimmerer, who is an attorney in Pasadena, Texas, who was reared in Cincinnati, Ohio, and whose mother is still living at the age of 101 and lives alone and cares for herself. She's a hardy soul. But Bob Zimmerer has correspondence in his possession written in German by Bernard Glockner to his in-laws and relatives back in Bingen-Baden relative to other members of the family coming to this country. And the cost of a trip from Bingen-Baden across the sea to Portsmouth or Cincinnati was $25, American dollars. And for them in Europe to raise or accumulate that kind of purchasing power, they had to sell off their lands of their farms. And that's what they did. When they were able to, they sold off the land and provided for another member of the family to come to this country. Undoubtedly, great-grandfather was much interested in that. It's also said that Magdalena, Bernard's widow and wife, always had 2 or 3, besides her 7 children, in her home who had come over from the old country, and they put them up and cared for them and provided and fed them until they were able to find employment and learn the English language and care for themselves. I have no idea how many, but they were noted for their generosity in that regard. Their home, and the only home that I know that they lived in, is in the 600 block of 6th Street and is still being lived in. It's just close by the church, and the west end of town was the German part of the community, called it Bonyfiddle. There's a lot of interpretation of why they called the area Bonyfiddle, but it was a fact that, as I've been told, that they had small gardens in their backyards, and some way the word Bonyfiddle is a derivative of a German phrase, and that's what it stands for. I'd like to shift a minute to back to each one of the children of Magdalena and Bernard Glockner. They undoubtedly were good, strong Catholic people. They were very devoted to their church and were generous in its support. The St. Mary's Church that was referred to in the article that I read to you, that was down on Market Street, was built in 1870. And of course it's our parish church today. And it was built for $3,000. And there wasn't a steeple put on that church until the early 1890s, which is the highest steeple or highest building in our community. I'd like to come back now to Frank Glockner, the oldest of the 7 children. Frank, as I told you earlier, had lost his wife in this terrible accident. And I know my grandmother took care of his son Frank, and I'm going to have to refer to the names of all of the children in Frank's family, but Frank had 6 children that lived, and Mary Aquina, who I heard much about, lived in Indianapolis, Indiana. It was interesting that Frank's mother-in-law took all these children back to Lawrenceburg, where she had lost her husband and had had a store and I think a grocery store, and she ran that store and raised his family, and she was very much interested in all those children having the best possible education she could afford to give them. So I know Mary, I believe, ended up being a school teacher and an old maid and died in Indianapolis. Herbert Joseph, who went to California, but he married a Helen Rose Staub, S-T-A-U-B, from Lawrenceburg, Indiana, and of course they had 4 children. Gertrude, who married a Walker, and his only son, Francis Herbert, who is known as a nickname by the name of Buzz, B-U-S, and Buzz was had gone overseas prior to World War II, as I understand, and worked in Saudi Arabia, and came back to the States and enlisted and was in a construction battalion in the Navy. And when he came out of service, he went back and finished his college and went into the general contracting business on his own. And I didn't meet him until the last 8 years, and I have a wide acquaintance of automobile dealers around the country, and happen to know the Cadillac dealer on the West Coast, who couldn't say enough good things about Buzz Glockner. And Buzz married May Rhea DeLong, and they have 4 children. And but going back to Gertrude has 2 children, son James Robert and Elizabeth Ann, and like I say, Buzz has 4 children, a son Donald Herbert, who lives in Seattle, Washington, and is a CPA and has been in the publishing business, and only has 1 daughter by his marriage. And Lois Jean married a Tom Michaels, and they have 3 children, a son and 2 daughters. And Linda Sue married a Stornetta, John Stornetta, and they have 3 children, a boy and 2 girls. And then their youngest daughter, Kathy, has never married and lives up in Oregon. By the way, Lois Jean and her husband Tom Michaels live in Days Creek, Oregon. They're ranch people and timber. They're in the timber business. And Linda Sue's husband is associated with the phone company, and Kathy is has been teaching in the grade school system and is now in a college level of teaching in the Oregon area. Then Margaret Mary, who had been injured in an accident, never married, and she passed away in 1986. And Barbara Louise married George Gowen, and they have four children, and Christy Marie, and who married a Sadler, and Joyce Louise, who married a Dunn, Dave Dunn, and Steve Craig, who married Sarah Stouffer, and I think he's in the state of Kansas and is a teacher. And Leslie Diane is married to Daniel Young. And that takes care of, I think, all of Herb Glockner's children. Then we come over, and there are two daughters of Frank's by the name of Gertrude Amelia, who never married and died in 1938 at the age of 38. Christine Mildred Glockner was born in 1895, died in 1930, never married at the age of 35. William Charles, William married an Olga Doss, who was from Arkansas. They have one daughter, Lynn Amelia. William was a veterinarian and worked for the government all his life and lived all over the South. And I never met him, but in later years, my father and his sister Helen and my mother had several visits with them down in Louisville. And of course, Bill and his wife are both deceased. Lynn married a Dalcom, and he works for the state of Kentucky, and they have two daughters that are college age. And I guess Frank Aloysius is the only one that I really got to know back in the late 1940s and early 50s. He came back with his wife and Irene and bought some cars from us, and they have four children. They have their daughter June. Irene married Ed Unger. Ed was from San Francisco, ended up being sales manager of 3M Corporation, and lived in Minneapolis, Minnesota until the last few years, and they moved to Phoenix, Arizona, where they've retired. They have five children. I know one daughter lives in New Zealand and has a family, I believe, of three. They have a younger son that is not married, that lives in the Minneapolis area. I'm almost afraid to say anymore. They have a daughter, Jane, and Cynthia, and Marie Ann, and one of those girls lives on the continent, married I believe a Hollander, and another daughter lives in the Boulder, Colorado area, and the other daughter is still single and lives in the San Francisco area. I think that then there's Frank Aloysius, who we call Wink, who has a son and a daughter, and he lives in South Laguna Beach, California. And they had a son, David, who was born in 1931, was killed in 1953 in a pedestrian car accident. And their youngest son, James Joseph, who was heavy in real estate. And by the way, Frank was in real estate in the California area, and in the Los Angeles area, I should say. And his son Jim followed in that footsteps, but Jim died April the 10th of 1987. And he was quite a character, and we really all enjoyed him. He never married, never had any children. So the only offspring are from the two marriages, June and Frank, of Frank's family. So that covers Frank Glockner, the oldest son of Bernard and Magdalena. Now I'll take you over to Anna Glockner, who married Adolph Myers, M-E-Y-E-R-S. And I did get to know them as a young boy, and was always interested in them. Adolph Meyer was a meat cutter and had butcher shops, and I know that he once lived in Lexington, Kentucky, and came back to Portsmouth. And I know Sister Aquin influenced him in coming to Rochester, Minnesota. And Ann and Adolph had 4 children, and they had Mary Myers, and she had no children. Magdalena, called her Lena, Elizabeth Myers, died at the age of 19 and had no children. Charlie Myers died was born in 1882 and died in 1950 and had no offspring. Louise Meyer was the same way, had no offspring, never married. And then we come to Adolph Meyer, who had 4 children, and the oldest one was Audrey Gertrude, and she married Chester Castle, and they live in Washington. James F. Meyer died at the age of 20, never married, didn't have any offspring. Audrey, by the way, has 3 children, William Scott Castle and Carol Jean Hyatt, and Kenneth James, and they all live in the state of Washington. Then Robert Meyer, Bob as we call him, has been a rancher and a very successful one in the area of inland Washington, I want to say. I've forgotten where. I want to say Pasco, Washington, but Yakima, Washington. He had beef cattle. I understand from a fellow I flew with in service who knows Bob real well. I've only met Bob once. He's quite a guy. He has a restaurant now and plays around with some race horses. He had 2 daughters by his marriage, and he has Kathleen Fay, who married a Hill, and Roberta Ann, and they have children. And then Shirley, the youngest, married a Pascal Hancock, and she has 2 children, Peter Michael and Tammy Marie. But Shirley's husband died about 4 years ago, and she lives in the Washington area. Probably one of the most colorful people I've ever met, and I met him back in 1967, and was really the person that brought together the Glockners and Portsmouth Glockners and the Myers, and of course we've always had a relationship with Jim Glockner. Has found great interest in his relationship back here, and so over the years the Meyer family has been out of touch, and basically Sister Aquin was the one who really kept the family together. She really was concerned about her brothers and sisters, brothers and sister, and she really kept up on them. But anyway, it would be an interesting half-hour story to tell how it came about that Bill Meyer and his wife Cecilia what a great pair they were, and they had 2 sons, William B. Meyer, and Bill had a daughter and a son, and he just lost the son right before the end of the year in 1988 of cancer at the age of 37, and he had a family that he left behind, and they have a daughter, Mary Louise, and she has a daughter, Penny Jean. Then Byron Meyer, probably more like his dad than anyone, but I'd like to go back to Bill Meyer, the youngest son of Anna and Adolph. As a young fella, he went out to the West Coast, and he homesteaded land in the Yakima Valley, and he ended up was quite an adventurer, I guess, and he stowed away on a ship during the gold rush days, the late 90s, up into Alaska, and didn't have a thing financially, and I guess they found him aboard ship, but he had quite a personality. But he ended up staying up in the gold rush, and I guess he made a little money and came back down to the Yakima Valley and moved his mother and family and father and the family out into that area, and they set out a apple orchard, and they were quite sizable farmers, wheat and cattle farmers, and I know they leased land from the Indian reservation that's close by them, and Byron has told some good stories, and I hope that he tapes some of his because they really are interesting. His son Byron has married Glenna May O'Leary, and they have 2 sons, Timothy Francis, and he has 2 sons, David Byron and Alex D. And Scott Phillip is still living at home and is a well-educated young man, but really hasn't caught on to what he wants to do yet. So that takes care of Anna Glockner and her family. Of course, Louise Glockner became Sister Ackwin, and Sister Ackwin was quite a person. I'd like to read what was written of her, both in the history of this order and her obituary, which one of the sisters just sent me, taken out of the archive files of the Rochester Franciscans. But she died in 1941 and at the age of 83, and she had fallen and broken her hip and was quite a large woman, but very learned and very stern. And I know as a young boy, when she'd come home on visits, I was just real scared of her. And I know she was home for a visit one time when Anna and Adolph Meyer were here visiting, and it was interesting for me to listen to them visit, although I didn't remember all of the stories. But I know in listening to Sister Ackwin talk about relatives and first cousins once removed and second cousins and double cousins, and just infatuated me. And she's really responsible for the family tree and the genealogy that we have on the Glockner family, because on her 25th anniversary of her profession as a nun, her brothers gave her a gift of a trip to Europe, and she went back to Bingen-Baden, and of course she spoke and read German, and she looked up all of the baptismal records that there at the little church in Bingen-Baden, and she brought all this information back, but no one did anything with it until 1969, when my father and my brother sat down and put all this format of this family tree together, which I hope all of you have and are keeping, because there aren't many families that have the perpetuation and the knowledge of their ancestry and its lineage that we have. It was my experience for my brother Dave and I, and my wife Joanne and I 2 years ago this month, to have gone to Germany, and we went to Bingen-Baden, and of course we don't speak German, we don't read German, but we took the family tree with us, and the deacon at the church that still exists in the little town, and it's very small, I'd say maybe 24 houses. By the way, the Glockner home that was built in the early 1700s is still intact. It's been remodeled since 1970, but the cornerstone is still there, and it's still being lived in. And the last Glockner relative that had ownership of it had adopted a war orphan out of World War II, and they have since deceased, and they left that home to this individual, and we talked with him through an interpreter, and we have pictures of it, and of course we have pictures of it that when Aunt Helen and my Aunt Ann were in Germany probably 12 or 15 years ago, maybe longer than that, before it had been remodeled. So, but anyway, the church archives, these people couldn't get over the detail and the authenticity of how well this family tree was put together, and everything we had on there until this those that were born in this country, but all the records on these families are still intact, and it's amazing the how well kept the records are. So that's how we came to having what we have as to our ancestry and our lineage. To finish up on my little story about Sister Ackwen, whether you know this or not, the Mayo Clinic was, of course, started by the Mayo brothers as a result of a tornado that had done great devastation to that area. But the Sisters of St. Francis, which Sister Ackwen was a very active member of, were instrumental in the development of St. Mary's Hospital, which is about a 1,400 bed hospital, and the Mayo Clinic. And Sister Ackwen also had the responsibility. They had members of their order that were having tubercular problems, which was common of the era. She went out to the West Coast and bought property and developed a convalescent home for the tubercular members of their order. And of course, when she was in the West Coast, she was diligent to make sure that her brothers, Frank and Bill, and their offspring were all staying true to their Catholic faith, and if they weren't, she really worked them over. And she had great interest in the preservation of the saving of one another's souls and the honor and glory of God and the love of God. And I know I do not have with me, as I'm sitting here this evening, her obituary, but I will bring that into play later on in my discussion. But before I leave Frank Glockner too far behind, I have a biographical sketch of him was printed in a 1899 history of Scioto County, Portsmouth, Ohio, and I'd like to read it to you. Frank A. Glockner, a son of Bernard and Magdalena Beck Glockner, native of Bingen-Baden, Germany, was born August 26th of 1855 in Portsmouth, Ohio. He attended St. Mary's School and later took a course of study in a business college. He learned the tinner's trade at H. Eberhardt's, and after finishing his trade, assisted his father in the hardware business. His father died in 1876, and he took charge of the business for his mother until 1884. In that year, he moved to Lexington, Kentucky, and was engaged in the shoe business in that place for 5 years. In 1889, he went to Cincinnati for 4 years. He carried on a grocery business. In 1893, he returned to Portsmouth, and since that time has been engaged in the stove and hardware business at 121 and at 1210 and 1230 Gallia Street. On May 15, 1889, he was married to Mary E. Lang of Lawrenceburg, Indiana. She died November the 5th, 1901, at the age of 39. They had 8 children, Magdalene and Frank, who died in infancy, Mary, Herbert, Frank, William, Catherine, and Gertrude. So this is the only written background that we have, and the hearsay that I was told by my family, and my Aunt Helen especially, Aunt Helen Glockner, about the Frank Glockner and the Meyer family and Sister Aquin, Louise Glockner. Now we're down to Alex M. Glockner, who I am an offspring of, who was my grandfather. And I think I'll just start off with the biographical sketch that was written in the 1899 history of Scioto County. Alex Martin Glockner was born April 9th, 1866 in Portsmouth, Ohio, the son of Bernard Glockner and Magdalena Beck Glockner. His father came to America in 1847 and his mother in 1853. They were married in 1854. He received his early education in St. Mary's Catholic School, which he attended for 6 years, at the end of which time he entered his mother's hardware store to work, but he did not like it, and learned the molder's trade, at which he worked for 5 years. He then took a course in the Portsmouth Business College and again entered the hardware store owned and conducted by his mother. His father engaged in the hardware business in 1872, succeeding John B. Rottinghouse. He died October 27, 1876, and the business was conducted in the name of his mother, Mrs. M. Glockner, until October 22, 1891, when she died. The business was then purchased by Alex Glockner, who has owned and managed it ever since. It is now one of the largest and most substantial retail businesses in the Portsmouth area, and it is a credit to the town as well as its young and energetic proprietor. Our subject was married to Adelaide Lange, Lange, daughter of John Lange, that's really daughter of Joe Lange, January the 11th, 1892, by whom he has 2 children, but they had 4 children. Edward, age 7, who was my father and the only son of that marriage, and Helen, age 5, who never married and died in 1984, I think at the age of 87. He is a member of St. Mary's Catholic Church and a member of the Knights of St. George. He was reared a Democrat but does not follow his early teachings very closely. On the contrary, he is very liberal in his political views. While nominally a Democrat, he votes for the man and the measure oftener than for the political party. Mr. Glockner is an excellent example of what is called American energy and push. Starting but with little more than an ordinary boy, he has, by constant application of industry and acute business insight, established a business which is a shining index to his business ability. Besides being a first-class businessman, he is a true sportsman and takes a keen interest in his dogs and gun and fishing tackle, as he does in his business. One of his chief delights is to follow the hounds or hunt beside a blooded pointer or a setter. And that's true. I was only 5 years old when grandfather died, and I feel like I know him, but I know I was too young to really know him. I guess my being the first grandchild and the first grandson, he probably had a lot of hopes and enjoyment about thinking about the future. But the thing that I have enjoyed about him is the stories that they tell about him and what a character he was. I guess he was jovial. He never knew a stranger. He was a hard, disciplined businessman. He wasn't afraid of a risk. He gave much to the community, both in money and of his time, as we read earlier in my comments about his being involved in stockholder in the largest hotel in our community, which is now a retirement home or retirement apartments, and he was involved in the construction of a bridge across the river, which opened up all the commerce from the Kentucky side of the river. It was dependent on the big city of Portsmouth for its goods and services and professional and health care, and still is. But he loved to hunt, and I guess he had a philosophy: when business was good, you could afford to go hunting and fishing, and if business was bad, there was no use staying around the business because there's nothing you could do about it, so you go hunting or fishing. So he and his brother Adolf, Uncle Adolf, whom he took into the business as a full partner in the hardware business, were quite the guys with their guns and sportsmen. Of course, they would go out and stay with these farm people who came in and dealt with them, bought from them, and they very hospitable, and they would go out and hunt dove and quail and rabbit, and I can feel like I can remember, although I've seen pictures of just string after string of birds still in the feathers. I mean, they'd gutted them, but it was cold in the winter, and that was their means of preserving and keeping them frozen, would be strung across the back porch high in the air. And Grandpa's wife, my grandmother, was just a great cook. And but anyway, they hunted behind and over English pointers and setters, and they bred their own dogs and always had a kennel full, and they were just known all over. Grandpa was a great, he and Adolf both were great for going to Canada and hunting bear and elk, and never heard too much about deer because there was plenty of deer around this area. But Aunt Helen always told me about him, that when business and the pressures of business and he would get upset about things, he would just go down at the park on the riverbank and sit and watch the river, and seemed to be his means of relaxing and getting away from it all. Of course, my grandfather married my grandmother, who was Maria Adelaide Lang, and she was just a wonderful lady. And of course, they had 4 children. My father was the oldest. My Aunt Helen was the second, and Louise, who became Sister Thomas Ackwin in the same order as Sister Ackwin was in, and they were at the mother house together. She was a tall, stately, jovial, just a lovely person, and a very talented, musically talented person. And then she had a younger sister, Anna, who married Edwin von Lerty. And Anne is still living today, but is not in good health at all, and I think she's about 82. But Sister Thomas Ackwin was at missions within a 30-mile radius of Portsmouth, so as I grew up, we were with her quite a bit. I was with her on her deathbed, always wrote to her all the way through service, and of course I feel her prayers helped me, and but just loved her, and She died in 1946 of cancer at the age of 46. So that's the background on my grandfather. Now my father was, like I say, the only son, and like many fathers and sons, they didn't get along together. And that was true of my grandfather and my father. And my father was a very talented fella. I don't know if he was spoiled or not, but he was a good mechanic. And of course, he and my grandfather chose to take on the Chevrolet franchise in 1912. And we think we're the old, and of course, to go a little farther with the Chevrolet franchise, there was a fellow by the name of Bill Durant who started General Motors Corporation, and he was from Flint, Michigan. He came off a farm and came into Flint and went to work as an insurance salesman, and there was a buggy manufacturer in Flint, and he went to him and asked, how many buggies can you build a year? And the man said around 1,800, and he said, I'll buy them all. And with that, they made a deal with the guy and with the manufacturer, and he went off and he chose hardware merchants to be his outlets or his dealers to sell these buggies. And he came to Portsmouth and he induced grandfather to take on the buggies. This was in 1906, 1904, and Bill Durant went on to get into the automobile business by starting the public company of General Motors Corporation, and they bought the Oldsmobile and manufacturing facilities, and then Buick, and weren't making money, and the stockholders voted him out as president of the company, and he left and went and started building a car and wanted to race that car because Oldsmobile had gotten their notoriety and their imagery by racing on dirt tracks. Of course, the cars would only do about 30 miles an hour, but that was fast compared to the horse and buggy. So Durant got a hold of a fellow by the name of Louis Chevrolet, who was French, and a race car driver, and his brother, who were both good mechanics, and they built a car and they raced it and called it Chevrolet after Louis Chevrolet. And Bill Durant went out to build a dealer organization who would buy these cars and sell them under a franchise system, as much as we have today. And he came back to these same hardware merchants who had bought buggies from him, and that's how he came back to grandfather. And in 1911 was the first year they built Chevrolet, and he signed up grandfather and shipped the first Chevrolet that was shipped to them was a 1912 model. And they had to drive those cars down from Flint, Michigan, and the rear ends in them were a regular Model T rear end, and there were only dirt roads all the way down, and it would take them a couple of days to drive, and my dad would go up with a group of young fellows, and they'd drive these cars back, and of course the weather was bad and wet. They got stuck in the mud and snow and everything else, but when they got them back, they really had to overhaul the rear ends on them, and in many cases put new rubber on. But in order to buy those cars, they had to pay for them, and of course to sell them there was no such thing. The banks wouldn't finance a car, and of course the people were skeptical of them. These are stories that my father told me, that, of course, they ended up trading people out of horses and buggies as trade-ins on automobiles, on Chevrolets. And of course, they became what you call a horse trader. Only the first horse traders, rather than trading horse for a horse for an iron horse or a Chevrolet. At the same time, my dad took on the Harley-Davidson motorcycle franchise and moved a fella into Portsmouth by the name of Harry McNair from Jackson, and they were all young fellas in their late teens and early 20s, and there are a lot of good tales and a lot of pictures in our possession of their experiences riding those Harley-Davidson motorcycles, which were a little bit more than a motorbike, but I know they built a flood wall around Portsmouth after 1913, someplace around 1917, and those fellows used to ride those motorcycles on that flood wall, which was only 24 inches wide, and some places 20 feet drop off of the sides, and they would ride that flood wall for 6 and 7 miles and no one fall off. So they were pretty good riders, I would say. Of course, they raced motorcycles. But the interesting story always was that Grandpa was coming from lunch one day from out the street, and he saw a real bad car accident at the corner of 3rd and Gay Street, which was a block from the hardware and the Chevrolet dealership. And my dad walked in the back door, and his father was laughing about seeing this accident and how bad the cars were tore up, and one car was turned over, and he didn't bother to go up to see if anybody was hurt, and he was just chuckling about it. And my dad hated to tell him, but it was Grandpa's car, and my dad was driving it, that had been wrecked. And of course that made the story less amusing for Grandpa, and more severe and irate in words toward my father. And my grandfather rode him so heavy about that that he wouldn't let him drive, so to keep him from stealing the car, he chained the wheel around, a chain around the wheel and a chain around a tree. And my dad, they at night, all they'd do would take the hub bolt off and let the wheel lay against the tree, and had another spare wheel and put on it, and they'd go and run the car all evening and come back and put the chained up wheel back on it, and Grandpa never knew about it. But eventually the severity of the criticism over that accident, my dad enlisted in the Army and as a mechanic and in World War I, and he ended up as an advance group going to France, and the United States was building an American SPAD aircraft, and it was being crated over on steamers, and they were to assemble them and put them in a final manufactured condition to be used in combat. And my dad went over and set that assembly up with a group, and was recommended. He was a top sergeant, and when he was recommended for a commission, and when the war was over, but he ended up with Rickenbacker's squadron, and we have some squadron insignias off of those canvas-covered planes that he brought back from World War I. But my dad always had an interest in flying, and so anyway, my dad married my mother. My mother was named Helen Folz, F-O-L-Z, from Cincinnati, and her great-grandfather came over from, or her grandfather came over from Germany, and he was name was Dave Folz, and he was a street contractor in Cincinnati, Ohio. Most of the streets of the old part of the city were all cobblestone, limestone, hard limestone, granite stone streets, and that's what he did. And she was the second of 8 children, and always wondered how my dad met her. And I heard stories as I was younger, and my dad had a cousin by the name of Anna Ruthemeyer, and I since found out that Anna Ruthemeyer's mother was a Zimmerer. Now you're going back to her mother was her grandmother was Anna Zimmerer. So Anna Ruthemeyer was a first cousin to my dad, and my mother's best friend. And Anna Ruthemeyer introduced my mother to my father, and they were wed, and I'm the result of their first offspring, and I'm the oldest of 6 children. But I want to digress for a minute. Anna Ruthemeyer in turn married my dad's best friend, an Irishman by the name of Bill Fogarty, from Jackson, Ohio, which is a little town about 35 miles from Portsmouth. And Bill Fogarty was a Harley Davidson motorcycle rider with part of the motorcycle gang. And Bill ended up moving to Cincinnati, where he married Anna Ruthemeyer, and we were always good friends, the family, the Ruthemeyers. They had 3 children, Bill and Joe and Anna Kathleen, and we still keep in contact with them. So that is from the Beck side of the family, but interesting how that came about. Well, coming on back to Alex Glockner's son and my father, there were 6 children. I was the oldest of the 6. I had a brother, Leo, that was 20 months younger than myself, and a sister, Janet, 4 years younger, and brother Dave, who was 8 years younger, and brother Bill is 10 years younger, and brother Don is about 13 years younger. My brother Lee and I failed in the 3rd grade of grade school, and my brother Lee caught up with me, so we went through grade school and high school. Went our freshman year to college at St. Joseph's College at Rensselaer, Indiana. I had a football scholarship there, and my dad said, this was in 1940-41, my dad said there was going to be a war, and you didn't need to have a education to fight a war. And he said, you guys are going to be in it. So we didn't go back to school after our freshman year. We went to work in a defense plant for Curtiss Wright Corporation, building aircraft engines, and I always said, I hope I never have to fly behind one of those engines. Well, Pearl Harbor happened about 6 months after we went to work, and of course a couple of my friends were injured at Pearl Harbor. I had wanted to enlist in the Navy when I came out of high school. My dad wouldn't sign for me, and so we disturbed me. I had saved enough money to buy a new car. I had about $1,200, so I went back to college and got a private pilot's license under the old civilian pilot training program, and then enlisted in the Naval Air Corps. In the meantime, my brother Lee enlisted in the Naval Air Corps, and he went into civilian pilot training along with a first cousin, Bob Glockner, who, well, Bob isn't the first cousin, he was the first cousin of my dad. He's the youngest son of Adolph Glockner, which we'll get to. But he and my brother Lee were stationed together, and then they were 7 weeks behind me, and we all ended up being stationed together at the University of Iowa for 6 weeks before I left. And but anyway, my brother Lee I was commissioned in July of '43 from Corpus Christi, Texas, as a torpedo pilot, and was on my way to Jacksonville, Florida for operational training in combat aircraft. And I stopped off to see my brother Lee, who was a cadet at Pensacola, and had 4 nice days with him. And about 7 weeks later, he was killed after he'd completed his training in a extra flight that was given to his squadron for outstanding achievement, and in a freak accident, flying in a right echelon. The instructor who was leading them flew into a flock of pelicans, and one of the pelicans hit the leading edge of my brother's plane, knocked the pitot tube off, which causes the function of the airspeed indicator, and it also dented the leading edge of the plane, which made the plane unstable from a lateral standpoint. He took the plane up and tested its stalling characteristics, and made an approach to the airport. Evidently got too slow because the wing dropped and they went into the swamp, and he and the boy that was flying with him were killed. And it was interesting, after all these years, about 5 years ago, a fellow that I grew up with said, "I saw your brother killed." He said, "We were on field maneuvers in the swamps, and I saw that plane go down about a mile from me, and of course," he said, "when I got back to camp and had word from home, why, I knew that the time and the day that was the accident that I had witnessed." So it's a small world. So that took care of my brother, and my sister Janet married a fellow that I had gone to school with, only a couple of years older than I, and by the name of Joe Gallenstein, and they had 10 children. I married Joanne Crick, K-R-I-C-K, a local girl, and in January of 1950. We have a daughter, Susan, was born in 1950 in late October, 9 months after our wedding. And my son Andy was born 2 years later, and our daughter Mary Ann was born 15 months after that. And we've never had any more children. Meantime, my brother Dave and brother Bill got married in 1950, and they each have 12 children, and my sister Janet has 10, and my youngest brother Don, who, by the way, was a jet pilot and an air transport pilot in the Army Air Force, Air Corps, during the Berlin airlift and the Korean War, and he came out of service and went to work as an air traffic control person at Greater Cincinnati Airport, and he retired 3 years ago as a supervisor from air traffic control. They have 7 children. So there are 44 offspring of the 5 marriages of my mother and father. And last I counted, with all of the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, those that have married into the family, there's 142 out of my mother and father's beginning of we 5 living offspring. So we constitute a big bunch on this family tree, and there are 24 Glockner boys out of those 44 children, and I think that we think the Glockner name's going to stay around a while, but I don't think we'll ever see the large families that we had, and it's just great. I just love my nieces and nephews, and there's some good stories to tell about them. I'd like to tell some stories since I guess while I'm on myself and our side of the family. When we were kids, of course, the Glockners, when grandfather died in 1925, they had a lot of debt, and of course the Depression hit them, and which I think the same thing happened to the Glockners on the West Coast. But there is a honesty, moral ethic that I feel has been transmitted through the Glockner family, and not just the Glockner family, but I just think specifically there's something that continues to flow through that honesty is the best policy, and if you owe somebody, and I don't know of any of them that have ever taken a bankruptcy to avoid paying a creditor, but the whole concept of my grandfather, and I know his brothers, that if it took you 3 generations to pay off your creditors, that's what you did. And with the Depression hitting and the large debt and the drop-off and the bank holiday trapping all their working capital that they did have in the banks, they were forced by their creditors to liquidate their inventories, and that's what they did with the hardware store, and they lost the real estate. The dealership real estate was taken back for a $30,000 note by Penn Mutual Life Insurance. I can remember when they were auctioning off the inventory at the hardware store, and it was bringing about 10 cents on the dollar, of my dad and his sister, Aunt Helen, standing out on the sidewalk just crying because, and they were young. I mean, you got to remember that my dad was in his early 30s, and Aunt Helen, and so it was a tough time, and I know, in looking at the financial statements that I have that have been accumulated back into the 1900s, but I don't know how they made it through the Depression years, and then here by 1940 they were getting their act together, and things were going well for them, and here comes the war. Of course, you got to remember, and I think it's interesting, that your great-grandfather, they left Germany. The story that's been heard, they left Germany to get away from Kaiser Wilhelm. to get away from wars. Here they come over here in 1847. What happens to them? Here comes the Civil War. And I don't know what went on. I know, the Ohio River is a Mason-Dixon line, and Portsmouth's on the north side of the Mason-Dixon line. But the people on the south side of the Mason-Dixon line, on the Kentucky side, in eastern Kentucky, were anti-slavery. So most of them fought with the Union. I guess grandfather and great-grandfather and his brother have not heard anything about what they did or what went on during the Civil War. The only thing I know is on my grandmother's side, her father, Joe Lang, was the bookkeeper in the Gaylord Mill, which was a pig iron and iron mill on the riverbank at Portsmouth, when Morgan's raiders came and got in behind the Union lines and north of the Mason-Dixon line and were pillaging and burning towns and any manufacturing process they could, and they got within 12 miles of Portsmouth and for some reason diverted away. But great-grandfather Lang tore up the floor in his office and dug a hole and buried all of what currency they had and the books underground, and in case they burnt that mill down. Well, Morgan's Raiders didn't have to burn it down. It burned down of its own accord a couple of years later. But that's the only thing that I've heard in the family about the Civil War. But here we come up into Portsmouth was inundated. It's been a flood town ever since, and most of the river towns have been on the Ohio and the Mississippi, are subject to floods, and they had no history of a 50-year flood factor or a 100-year flood factor like they have today. But 1913, the normal pool stage of the river before they built dams was 9 feet. And the water flood level in 1913 was 63 feet. So, that's 54 feet above normal pool stage of the river. And of course, that came up and got in all the homes. The family have lost so much because of the floods inundating those homes, never thinking the water would ever get up as high as it was the last time. Lost their pictures, their books, so much of the memorabilia that most people would have who lived in the same town for the number of years that, the Glockners have had roots in Portsmouth. I mean, we're into 140 years here now, and 141 years, and there aren't many families today that stay around in one and perpetuate themselves as long as this family has. And we've got, my grandchildren are 6th generation, and they expect to stay here and stay in business. None of us have ever gone in business to build a business up and to sell it. We've got an old saying that's been drilled into me, and it's a truism, that first generation starts a business, the second generation operates it, and the third generation liquidates it. In other words, shirt tails to shirt tails in 3 generations. There's less than 15% of businesses that perpetuate from a first generation to a second generation. In other words, 85% of businesses will be sold to satisfy the greed or desire for the liquidity that's locked in, or the value in that business by the person that started it. The second generation that gets it, there's less than 1% of the original will perpetuate into a third generation. I was a fourth generation in business and a third generation in the car business. And my son now is a fifth generation in business and a fourth generation in the car business. And we don't know of anybody that's perpetuated any better. And with the large families that we have, to have been able to buy and settle up with everybody without alienating and losing the love and respect and affection and the friendship and the family camaraderie has to say a lot for the character of the families and what's been transmitted through to everyone. So, but I want to go back about, I brought you up through the hardships of our ancestors. You know, we ended up in 37 with another flood that was 77 feet above that 6 foot, 9 foot normal pool stage of the river. And everyone thought the water would never get above 63 feet, so they put their pianos on a brick that would put them up 4 inches above what it was in 1913. And here they get 14 feet more water than that. So you know what, it put it on the second floor of most of those homes that were built that only had water on the floor of them in 1913. So it was a real devastating setback and have a real economic impact on any business, because you've lost business time, you've got to clean up, it's just a devastating period. And I was 16 in 1937, and it was interesting to live through that and to see how a town comes back and keeps going. But I think the big thing is that where I'm coming from, that my father didn't have, I don't know how he raised we 6 kids. And if it wasn't for Aunt Helen and her business sense and the little money she took out of the business, that in order for my dad to have a little more, but I know that $200 a month was the most my dad ever had at any one time to take care of his family. And he lost his home and never owned another home until 1955. So we lived in rented property. We wore hand-down clothes that came down from relatives in Cincinnati that weren't as severely affected. Didn't have any impact on me. Most of the guys I grew up with didn't have it either. So we spent, what did we do with our time? Well, we played ball. There wasn't jobs that you could find. So we spent a lot of time on the river. We lived within a block of the river, or 4 blocks of the river. So come May 15th, it was always a holy day. We would go down and go shiny hiney, skinny dip into the river. And I'm telling you, it was cold. But we never owned a bathing suit until we came out of service in 1946. Us guys built little old flat bottom John boats. And in fact, when I was in the 8th grade, another friend of myself, my mother, had taken my brother Bill down to Cincinnati Children's Hospital to have his neck was growing over to one side, and took him down to have something clipped in here and put in a brace. He was only 6 years old. And Pop, anyway, this other guy and I on Sunday morning went 6 o'clock mass. We got in that boat, that's 120 miles down the river. We had a little 5 horsepower outboard motor and 14-foot boat. We took off and we got down, well, we were sunk by a paddle wheeler that was coming up the river about 10 miles below town, and we jumped in the water and got the boat over to shore and unloaded it and got the water out of it and got going again. We got down, we made 100 miles that day because the river was up, the current was strong, probably 4 or 5 mile an hour current, and we didn't have to lock through the 5 dams to get that 100 miles in. So the next morning we got up and went on into Cincinnati and got a barge outfit to let us tie our boat up and take our motor off and store it. And we went uptown. I knew what streetcar to get on, and we took off to go out to my grandmother's, and we transferred to another streetcar to get there. And who gets on at the next stop but my mother? And of course she didn't at first see me, and I said, "Hi, Mom," and she said she wouldn't want to know what we were doing down there. Anyway, my uncles thought it was such a big deal. They had the local papers. When we left 4 days later to come back home, they put a picture on the front page of the paper, and we got up the river that day about 40 miles because we're going against the current. Rather than cook our meal on the riverbank, we walked up into town to buy a hamburger, and the people in the restaurant were looking at the paper and looking at us, and we didn't know this had been published, and so we became celebrities in the little small town of Augusta, Kentucky. So, but to me, we had a good life. And I'm sure most of us could say the same thing. I could never realize we'd ever live to have the nice homes and the excess of everything of what we need. And I've never been able to loosen up and spend money excessively. I'm just as tight today as I was any time in my life, and I can't tell you why. It's just built-in frugality, and of course we've tried to run our businesses that way because we've been in highly competitive businesses and with high mortalities, and that's the way we've gone. But my brother Dave, Bill and Don were like a second family, and while I'm telling all these stories, I might as well tell it all. There's a problem that we feel is inherited from my mother's side of the family, that we're bedwetters until we're quite old. I'm talking about getting up into 10 and 12 years old and still wetting the bed. And although my brother Lee and I weren't plagued with that, nor my sister Janet, my 3 brothers, Dave, Bill, and Don, were, and they all slept, 2 of them in one bed. And of course, in those days, you didn't have washers and dryers. You had a washing machine with a wringer dryer, but you had to hang your clothes outside, and of course you didn't have air-conditioned homes, and the protection devices for a bedwetter aren't what they are today. So I just look back on the hardship of the mothers with having to air out those mattresses, because it was always provoked me that when I heard one of my brothers peeing at night, it would set a chain reaction off. They'd all 3 be going, and then you could hear them slopping around in that situation. But they couldn't help it. But I just beat the heck out of them. I just, and as a result, they, in a way, have feared me most of my life, and have been half afraid of me, and has probably created a little distance between us that shouldn't have been, but I think we've done real well as brothers, and my sister is a duplicate of my mother. She can take everything in stride and is just a super gal. So let me go on to my Uncle Charlie Glockner. Uncle Charlie married Fanny Schockleiter, and they had 4 children, and the 4th child died in infancy, and they had a daughter, Columba, who was quite a gal, and always was trying to get a man. She finally I can remember, got a traveling salesman and married him and had a son by him, but the marriage didn't work out. The son was killed in a car accident. Columba died at the young age of 56, and that was her life. She had a brother, Charles, who married another Helen. We have 3 Helen Glockners. My Aunt Helen, they called my mother Little Helen, and this Charlie Glockner, number 2, married a Helen Dorr Glockner. They had 1 daughter, Joanne. Charlie, to me, died young, although he was 62 or 63, and his wife died at the age of 55, and the daughter is 60 years old now and has never married, and her name is Joanne. So we've got 3 Joanne Glockners, my Joanne, this Joanne, and my cousin Bob Glockner's wife is Joanne, so who is part of Adolph's lineage. So the only living member of Uncle Charlie's family is Madeline Glockner, and Madeline is 90 years old now, and we take care of her. She's of good mind. Her body is weakening, but she was the first woman clerk hired by the Norfolk and Western Railroad, and she must have been just a real whiz on the typewriter. And of course the men resented it because they were all the clerks, but she withstood it and worked out her life with the railroad, and she's quite an interesting person, and just a good person, and so that takes care of Uncle Charlie. Uncle Charlie was a big man. I've got a recollection that Uncle Charlie and Sister Ackwen and Anna Glockner Meyer were big people. I would say Uncle Frank must have been a big person to look at him in his picture. Don't know what kind of weight he ever put on, but I'm sure he, but you know, their father was a small man, and Magdalena was small, and I don't know where all the stature came from in the boys in the family. I didn't know William Leo Glockner, who, you know, was born in 1871, and I don't know who he married. He died in California in 1935, so he was about 69 years old when he passed away, but he didn't have any children. I really don't know anything other than I understand that he was a little lax about his faith, and that Auntie Ackwen spent much time, and I hope that he died in the church and in the good graces of our Lord. And so now we're down to Uncle Adolph, who was I liked Uncle Adolph. Here was the youngest of the 7 children. He sold automobiles for 48 years and never learned to drive one. The only time that he ever drove one, they turned him loose in a pasture and in a cow pasture with one, but he would never drive. The only thing he knew about was where to honk the horn. Well, talking a little bit about Uncle Adolph, he married Blanche Emmert from Zanesville, Ohio. And they always talk about how Uncle Adolph went first class. I guess they had matching white horses and a buggy that just wouldn't quit. And of course they were married back in 1904 and probably in a little better shape than a lot of us, or a lot of people were at that time. But they were a great pair. Aunt Blanche Emmert Glockner was, I just have to smile because I had so much enjoyment out of living to have known him, and Uncle Adolph. They were just good people. Can't say he was much of a businessman, but he was kind, and he sure had to have made it to heaven.
Customer in the future.
What I will say to you is what you just said is 100% accurate, and it's not the way to proceed. This gentleman right here at lunch told me the same thing. It shouldn't be that way. When a guy gets his new car through quality leasing, he comes to the party, and the new car gross stays there. That's the way it's got to be. That's the way it's got to be. It's going to be fair.
Matter of fact, I think that the salesman should, since the records of the payments are being made, should be contacted 120 or 90 days before, so that he can contact that man and say, hey, what are you going to do? Because the man might not want to lease, and he might want to buy.
Yeah, let me explain something to you. I'm not here to start an argument
about
how to carve up this pie. What I'm here to show you people is how to increase the size of the pie. In your instance, if they go to quality leasing, $150 goes in the new car department, you get your lease gross, and that's all the Glockner organization makes. If it's funneled through him, you got your new car gross of $1,000 on top of the quality lease profit, and the Glockner organization and everybody in it is benefited by it. So my idea is not to start an argument about how we're going to carve up a pie this size, it's to show you that the pie is larger. It's just a preconceived notion, which is an error in some of your minds, that there's only one profit and that's all there is to it. That is an error. When you recognize why people lease, sell it properly, and figure out what services you're solving, what needs you're solving for your customer, you can make more profit, and you make your commission, and you make your commission, and everybody's happy. That's the answer. But what you said, he told me at lunch.
Well, they won't be able to make as much as they did before. If they were buying them at 150 over, and we're making $1,000 more on our end, and they sure can't put 1,000 on their end. They're going to blow that guy clear out of the ball.
That's wrong. That's wrong. If he's been leasing from you, the renewal factor, so you haven't tried it, so what you're saying, you're just presuming, is what I'm saying. You're just pulling it out of the air because you're used to selling cars, and if your car or truck is $10,000 more than the guy down the street, you're not going to sell it. That's called selling cars. We're not selling cars anymore. At least not for my purpose. Sure, we're going to sell cars. But for this meeting, we're talking about leasing cars. And you have to accept at least the basic premise that it's something totally different. When somebody's leased from you, they're going to continue leasing from you. I told you that the renewal factor, and that's the easiest. You talk about increasing your, I haven't even gotten into that. At renewal time, you really increase your margin of profit. Okay, you call it, put them on the elevator, tweak the price, whatever you. But there's nothing easier than the second go-around, because you control that customer, especially, as someone mentioned, if it's a premature termination. Hell, they can't go anywhere. They're at your mercy. Okay? So what you just said is 100% inaccurate. And I just won't sit here and say, yeah, okay, sounds good. That won't happen. That will not happen. You just think it'll happen. What? Try it. Just try it. Yes. Yes.
Explain to him why it won't happen.
Because you developed a relationship of trust with the customer. It's not your price versus someone else. It's what they pay you to lease for all the benefits that go with leasing. Not having to tie up their money, a new automobile, and all the things that I spent an hour talking about before lunch, why people lease. That's why they'll pay you. And if there's a lowball artist down the street, it's very easy to sell around because it's not the same type of lease. And if they sold your car to someone else and made a profit, you got them. I mean, what I'm saying is, sure, you get an isolated case, okay? You get an isolated case. I don't have 100% renewal. I told you, I only have 95%. So there are a few people that are going to go away for one reason. But you don't set up your business practices to take care of the one jerkomorph, the creep. You set up your business practices to take care of 95% of the happenings that go on. And in my travels, in my own business and in my travels, 95% of what I tell you is true. Not 100%, but 95% I can back up through my travels. And I would just ask you, again, to reinforce my credibility, it just isn't how Buzz Daring does it in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Okay? I'm not a bad salesman. Okay? This is what people do.